My name is Brian Manley. I'm the Chief of Staff with the Austin Police Department. I'm here today to talk about some of the issues and challenges we've had that are being reported on the Austin Police Department Crime Lab, along with some issues with the backlog. A little bit of history. The Austin Police Department Crime Lab has multiple different sections. We started processing DNA evidence back in 2004. We also have a chemistry section, a latent fingerprint section, along with serology and a few other areas. In talking about the DNA backlog, there's two different types of backlog that I think it's important that we distinguish between. The backlog that's getting a lot of attention right now are backlogged cases that we actually have a case, I believe the first one dates back to 1991, and we have 3,106 cases since that time. These are cases that were never submitted to the lab for analysis. They were submitted as evidence once they were collected, but then they were never requested for DNA analysis from the investigators. And there can be a lot of reasons for this. Some of those cases will involve a victim that, for whatever reason, chose not to move forward with their case. This is someone who survived a sexual assault but did not want to process through the criminal justice system with that case. It may be a case where we were able to secure a prosecution without processing that evidence. It may have been a known offender, and there may have been enough other evidence outside of that DNA safe kit that allowed for a successful prosecution. So for multiple reasons, these cases were submitted as evidence, but there was never a need to process these cases for the offense for which they were collected. And this is an issue that occurred not only here in Austin, but it occurred across the state and across the country. What we're now realizing is the best practice is we should be analyzing these cases. Although they may not have been needed to secure a prosecution in the case for which that evidence was collected, there may be a need to process that case to link it to another case where the suspect may be unknown. In other words, if we have a case with a known offender that we're able to secure a prosecution on based on other evidence, and we did not test that kit, if we test that kit and load it into the CODIS database, it could link to an unsolved case in our community or communities across this country. And again, this was a practice that was in place across the country. So we have crime labs across the country that are currently working through their backlogged cases. I think that's why we're seeing so much attention from different granting agencies that are making money available to clear up DNA backlog cases. The Austin Police Department is fortunate enough to have received a $2 million grant from the District Attorney of New York's program, allowing us to work on these 3,000 backlogged cases. And the first step in looking at these is a serology exam where we have to look at that DNA sample to determine is there even DNA in it. So the DNA analyst will conduct an initial test to get a presumptive result to determine if it then gets forwarded for DNA analysis. So we are working through those backlogged cases using the grant funds that we got from the District Attorney of New York. In addition to that, we have a backlog of cases that actually were submitted to the Austin Police Department's lab with a request that they be processed. And currently, as of this week, we have 1,253 of those cases, of which 600 are sexual assault cases. 208 of those cases actually have a DNA safe kit, and the remaining 392 are other pieces of evidence. It could be a piece of clothing, a piece of bedding, or something like that. So we have 600 cases in our current backlog that we have a request to process that are related to sexual assault. An additional 265 that are related to other types of crimes against person, and the remaining 388 are property crime cases. The main reason we have a backlog in the department is it's a capacity issue. We just don't have the capacity among our DNA scientists to process the number of cases for which we collect DNA evidence. An example, I guess just to give you the numbers that we have, we processed in 2007, we had a request for 639 DNA analysis for cases. This increased over the years. In 2008, 668. 2009, we went to 761. 2010, there were 844 requests. So this increase was steady over the past years, but it was most pronounced in 2013 when we ended up with 1,471 requests. This is the year in which we started collecting DNA in property crime cases. We realized that there could be benefits to collecting DNA in property crime cases for the fact that oftentimes a property crime offender becomes a violent crime offender at some point. So we began again collecting additional cases in 2014. We had 5 DNA analysts that were performing these analysis for us from 2010 through 2014, and we were able to secure 2 additional positions through our budget in October of 2014. The average caseload that a DNA analyst can handle is 10 cases per month. So if you just simply look at all those years we were operating with 5 analysts, our capacity was about 50 cases a month. And with these 2 additional analysts we got in October of 14, our capacity was 70 a month. And that has to take into account, obviously, we have analysts that will have to take time away for training, for vacation, sick time, so our maximum capacity was below the average 94 cases we were receiving per month. So we were just getting steadily behind with our ability to process these cases. So that's how we ended up with the backlog in the position that we're in. We're addressing that now. We've got an agreement with the Texas Department of Public Safety. They have agreed to take 20 cases from us per month. So these are cases that are in our current backlog, the 1,200 we just spoke of, and DPS has agreed to process 20 of those cases per month for us. On top of that, the Travis County District Attorney's Office is also getting cases analyzed if it's necessary for cases that are getting ready to go for prosecution. So there's a couple steps that are being taken right now to address the backlog that's in the system. This is the area where we're also making great strides with grants. We mentioned earlier this week that we were fortunate to receive a grant from the NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, $199,000. This is on top of a few other NIJ grants we already have that still have funding in them for working on the backlog. So we're using the money from these NIJ grants that we have to process our current backlogged sexual assault DNA kits. And then, as you heard us say during budget, and we stand ready to say again today, is that we're going to dedicate whatever internal resources we need also to cover the gap that the grants don't handle. We continue to seek out grants to assist us with our backlog, again, as do police departments and crime labs across the country. Everyone is trying to work through their backlogged issues. So that is our commitment to this community, to the commitment to the survivors in this community, and to those agencies that support our survivors, that we're going to take the steps that are necessary to clear up the backlogged cases in the manner that I just described. The timeline for getting these cleared up, as I mentioned, we're going to send out the 20 a month to DPS, and then we're also going to outsource the remainder cases to private labs. We're kind of at the mercy of those private labs, depending upon what their backlog is and what their processing time is. So we cannot give you an exact date when we'll work through all of the backlog, other than to say that it is our priority and we're putting all of our resources towards addressing that right now. There's another important thing we need to talk about today, and that is the crime lab itself. As you all are aware, we are currently have ceased doing DNA analysis in our crime lab while we do some retooling and retraining. But I think it's important also to talk about how did we get in a position to where we determined it was necessary to shut down our DNA operations. As I mentioned earlier, we opened up our DNA lab back in 2004. And since 2004, our lab has been audited 17 times. And these audits have come from different groups. One group is the ASCLAD Lab, and that is the American Society of Crime Lab Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board. This is our accrediting body. Other agencies that have come in and audited our lab have been the FBI's Quality Assurance Standard Assessment, the Office of the Inspector General, Department of Justice. We've had outside auditors come in. These will be individuals that lead crime labs in their communities. They have been part of audits of our crime lab. Out of these 17 audits that have been conducted on our lab since 2004, none of them had any findings regarding our casework and how we were doing DNA analysis. They had administrative findings. They had issues they might have brought up with the chain of custody or with the documentation. But as far as how we were conducting the science of our DNA analysis in the 17 audits conducted since 2004, there were no findings that we needed to make any changes. So our scientists in the lab were operating under that belief that the audits and the accrediting board that came in gave us the seal of approval for the methods in which we were employing. Earlier this year, we had a few retirements of high-level managers out in our DNA crime lab. Our crime lab is actually over all of the different services. We took this as an opportunity to do a review of our practices from a management and organizational perspective. Do we have the lab organized in the best manner? Is it staffed appropriately? Are the divisions of labor set up appropriately? And so we saw this as an opportunity as we looked to find the next leaders for our crime lab operations to make sure the operation itself was structured appropriately. To do this, we reached out to the Major City Chiefs Association, and they have a forensic science committee. We reached out to them in January, and they agreed to send two of their lead scientists to Austin at our request to analyze our lab operations. From February 1st through 5th, these assessors were on site, and they conducted a very focused review of our operations to identify areas for improvement in our management, our organization, and our structure. They did not come in to judge whether or not our processes were compliant. This was not a compliance audit to determine if the science that we were doing, the methods we were employing were appropriate. This was an organizational review. And that took place in February of this year. And that audit did have several findings on changes that we needed to make to our organizational structure, our staffing, and management type issues. We had another review that took place May 27th through May 28th. And this was a review conducted by the Texas Forensic Science Commission along with the ASCLAD lab group that I described earlier. This was a review that was conducted by the Texas Forensic Science Group on all publicly funded crime labs through the state of Texas, based on some issues that had been identified in the methods labs were using to analyze DNA sources that have a mixture, in other words, multiple contributors to the DNA source. Based on their concerns that they had noted when they looked at the protocols of crime labs across the state, they wanted to go in then and do an independent review of all of the labs. During their review of the APD lab, they had several findings, three of which were very important and that I will highlight today. The three are the issues with the manner in which we were doing our DNA analysis. They dealt with a contamination issue, and then they dealt with using certain types of chemicals beyond the recommended manufacturer's date. When we looked at the issue of how we were conducting our analysis, the Austin Police Department lab was using a method called quant-based ST. I'm not going to sit here and go into all the science behind that, but this was a method that we should have moved away from back in 2010. There were new recommendations and guidelines, although not statutory requirements. There were guidelines that we should have been following that came out of a 2010 analysis from the Scientific Working Group on DNA analysis methods. We call them SWAB-DAM. They came out with a new protocol in 2010, and what the Texas Forensic Science Commission audit of our department points out is that our scientists misinterpreted that, and they stayed with their quant-based method instead of switching to a new ST-based method. And therefore, we were using a method that was not the best practice anymore. Our lab conducted validation studies on this quant-based method, and the validation studies lacked sufficient data to support the method. But again, we continued to use this because we were getting regular audits, as we mentioned, 17 audits since 2004, and we're not having any findings that there were challenges with our processes. There were no other labs in the state of Texas using the method that we were using here in Austin after the 2010 SWAB-DAM report came out. Our lab was informed. The district attorney's office brought some concerns to us regarding the methods by which we were conducting our DNA analysis. But again, based on the multiple reviews by all of the agencies mentioned earlier, our accrediting board and the outside auditing agencies, our scientists felt like we were using an appropriate method. In short, what all this deals with is the methods in which we interpret our DNA results. We were using standards that we should have changed back in 2010 when we're looking at DNA cases with a mixture sample. The report also highlighted issues with contamination, and it actually lays out one case where we analyzed DNA from a survivor of a sexual assault along with a potential suspect that was linked to that case. The DNA analysis actually linked that suspect to the case when every other piece of evidence and every other part of the investigation did not link the individual. This individual was not a suspect and was not linked into this case. And that's what's important to know, is that DNA is just one component of any criminal investigation. We're not seeking convictions based on DNA alone, but DNA is one component. And so the investigators realized through all of their other investigation, through the statement of the survivor of that case, as well as other evidence, that this person could not have been involved. And what we believe happened in that case was that the DNA analyst actually analyzed the source from the survivor of that assault at the same time they analyzed the source from this individual suspect. And conducting those analyses at the same time, there was a cross-contamination, and that obviously is not something that is an appropriate practice, and we believe that that's what occurred in this case. We're going back and looking at the work of this analyst to ensure that this did not occur in any other cases. We're taking a look at a large sampling of cases from 6 months prior to this incident and a year after this incident, analyzing all of the work to ensure that we don't have any other concerns with any other of the casework that was done by this analyst. The other issue that was addressed and was brought up during this review, it identified 10 cases where an analyst used a contaminated reagent blank but still interpreted to the results. And what this showed is that they realized that the blank had been contaminated, but when they looked at the actual DNA analysis that they did using this, they just discounted those alleles where this contamination took place and made their identification based on the remaining alleles, when obviously we should not have used this at all. But again, they accounted for the contamination and removed it from their analysis, but this is not something that we should have done. We should not have used those tests. The last issue that I will talk about is that they identified a process where we were using reagents, and these are the chemicals that we use to conduct the initial analysis on a DNA sample to determine if it is of a large enough quantity and quality to where we should do a DNA extraction to do a DNA analysis. The manufacturer's recommendation for this reagent says to mix daily. Our analyst, we know of an analyst that was mixing this solution and then was using it until they used it all up. In some cases, it would take them a couple of days to use all of the solution that they had mixed, up to the longest period was 4 weeks. So we are currently looking at how that may have affected whether or not we forwarded cases for DNA analysis. In other words, if over the course of those weeks to up to 4 weeks, the reagent had lost an effectiveness to the point to where it didn't positively identify a sample that was strong enough for further examination. So we're going through a process now where we are recreating that. We are holding reagents beyond that day up to a 4-week period, and we're comparing the results from an analysis with that reagent with a reagent that was mixed fresh that day to see if there is any deterioration, and if there's any cases we want to go back and check again to see if we should be forwarding for a DNA analysis. What we have here is we have a failure where our checks and balances did not work. We had scientists that misinterpreted information that was guidance from a governing body, as well as from some of the leading DNA educational materials. We had 17 audits from various agencies and accrediting boards that did not find any issues with the way in which we were conducting our science analysis, but yet we were not following the best practices. For all of these reasons, we made the decision in June to shut down DNA operations in our lab. We realized that we want to make sure when we open back up that we're a better lab for having gone through this. There are a lot of lessons to be learned here. Each and every one of our DNA analysts is going through a complete retraining, regardless of their tenure with the department, regardless of their experience in this field. We are retraining all of our DNA analysts. We're relying on the Texas DPS lab for help with this. They're allowing us to utilize their services. They're helping train our folks. So we're getting this retraining done as quickly as possible. But again, kind of like with the outsourcing of the cases, we are at the mercy of another agency to some extent for how quickly we can get these individuals retrained. Our goal is to have our lab operational again for DNA functions in February of this month. However, it could take a few months longer depending upon the training times to get this done. We will not open the doors until we are confident that we're employing best practices with individuals that have received the best training, and we will seek one of our outside bodies to come in and do an audit of our operations before we begin conducting DNA analysis again. Our case generated a lot of discussion among the DNA community. Why didn't our accrediting boards, why didn't these audits pick up on a practice that should not have been in place after the 2010 guidelines? So there's a lot of discussion taking place right now between the Texas Forensic Science Commission, the AskLab Lab Group, and other leaders in this field to determine who should be responsible for looking at the practices, the science behind all of the labs, and what should that look like. So again, this is not a position we would want to be in as an agency, but we're here. We're going to make sure that we come out on the other end of this better for this, ensuring best practices, and that other labs as well will be employing best practices based on what we've learned here. The path forward from here, the district attorney's office has notified all criminal defendants, along with their attorneys that have been involved in cases where there was a mixed DNA sample, of the methods we were employing and of their rights to request a reanalysis of the DNA in their cases. They are also currently reaching out to all other criminal defendants and their attorneys in cases where DNA was used, letting them know what the process is as well for requesting a reanalysis of the DNA in their cases, and that is ongoing at this time. We are not aware of any case where we have an individual that was convicted unjustly based on DNA. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm not aware of a case where DNA was the sole piece of evidence, not discounting the value DNA adds to a criminal trial and how powerful that can be to a jury. We definitely understand the impact when you're talking about the likelihood of a person being involved in a crime is 1 in billions or quadrillions. It's an amazing science, but that being said, we also rely on everyday investigation and other means to link individuals to crimes. We are committed to ensuring through the review of our cases that we can say that about each and every case, that we have confidence that it was done right and that we don't have anybody that was unjustly convicted based on this, but we do not believe that that's going to be an issue. I think it's appropriate, and I want to thank our mayor and our city council. They saw fit in this budget year to give us the funds necessary to bring in 7 additional. We don't want to operate a lab that's in a constant backlog situation. We don't want to have to tell a survivor of a sexual assault that it's going to take us 242 days to process their DNA evidence. That's not something someone should have to hear. And the council heard that loud and clear. We had a lot of survivors. We had a lot of support groups that work with the survivor community here in Austin that had the courage to go to council and stand up and talk about their victimization and how it impacted them. And that, I think that really got the heart and mind of the council, and they realized that this was something that was so important that needed to be funded. And they've given us the funding in this year's budget to hire the additional staff to adequately staff our labs so we can process these cases in a timely manner. I also want to thank the support groups here that I just mentioned that reach out and work with the survivors of sexual assaults. Thank them for their continued partnership as well as their advocacy with council to get us the staffing so that we can get our operations back up and running and become a model personnel agency that is keeping up with our cases. And the last thing I want to do is just encourage the survivors of the sexual assault victimization here in our community. We know it's one of the most underreported crimes for a myriad of reasons that victims just choose not to come forward after being victimized. It is important that you do. We stand here today, as we always do, for you. We want to advocate for you. We want to seek justice for you and for the horrific crime that you survived. This is a stand we've had for many years. We work closely with our advocacy groups here locally. And again, we're working right now on some public service announcements, advocating for survivors to come forward, to prosecute a case, to come in and talk to us, to have the examinations done that's necessary. The evidence we gather may not only assist in getting justice for the victimization that your individual crime, but also linked to other crimes, and it may allow us to clear other crimes as well. So just a real encouragement to these survivors to please come forward and report your crime and allow us to do our best to prosecute and seek justice for you or others that may have been impacted by this offender. So with that, I'm going to stop my prepared comments and open it up for questions.
How many cases are called into question by the issues of the 2010 protocol, the cross-contamination, the old reagent? You said that all the criminal defendants have been notified, but I don't recall a number.
Sure, and I don't have the number for the exact. The Travis County District Attorney's Office is making notifications since that's going to be part of the criminal process. What we're doing with the specific contamination case that was mentioned in the forensic science report, we're analyzing that analyst's work, again, 6 months prior to this case and a year subsequent to this case, to ensure that there were no other issues with contamination or processing that we need to be concerned with.
Any idea though if it's tens, hundreds, thousands?
I would be speculating, and I prefer not to do that. I think if you reach out to the DA's office, they may be able to give you a better idea of what that number looks like.
The Safe Alliance points to the study of a similar backlog testing where they just did a 5,000 lab results test up in Ohio, and it found that half of the sexual assault cases were linked to multiple cases, or linked to multiple. It showed that there were predators. Do you expect to find the same results here, or have you found those similar results in previous testing of cases here?
Well, I think what you're hitting on is the importance of why we're going to go back and we're going to analyze these 3,106 cases that have been in backlog because there was never a request to actually process them. Again, that evidence may not be necessary for the case in which it was collected, but that evidence could be crucial to solving a different case that's unsolved at this point. If we have a case that we were able to secure prosecution on, and therefore we didn't test the sexual assault kit because it wasn't necessary, testing it now and loading it into code may link it to cases that are unsolved in this community or other communities. So I think it's going to be of great value locally as well as nationally as labs across this country clear up their backlogs and address this issue.
And one thing that stood out to me as far as the series of cases that we have locally is we have that the suspected sexual predator along North Jollyville Road, who may still be at large. Are those cases?
So there's two separate issues again.
So
again, remember, there's two separate issues. There's the issue of the 3,106 cases that are in backlog because we've never had a request to process them, and then there are the current cases that we're actually working on. I can assure you that we are prioritizing cases based on the need of that case to solve the underlying crime. If there is a suspected serial offender, then that is obviously a case we're going to get over to DPS or a private lab immediately to have it analyzed.
The chief indicated to council on Monday that the intent was to work through all of the new pending backlog by the time the lab reopens. Previous analysis had that if the council dedicated an extra $500,000, it would still take 4 years to work through that backlog. How much does the PD think it's going to cost to work through it in 6 months, and where is that money going to come from internally?
Yeah, there were a lot of discussions that were had with council council as we worked through the budget process. I don't think that it's possible, even if we had the funds to do it. Labs don't have the capacity to work through our backlog by February. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a priority for our department, and we're pushing forward to get these cases analyzed. Again, there's two different streams here. There's the backlogged cases that were not needed for prosecutions, the 3,000 cases that we're using the monies we got from the Danny grant, the District Attorney of New York. It was a $2 million grant, and we're working to get all of those cases cleared up. And then we're using the grants that we got from the NIJ to clear up the cases that are currently in our backlog, the 1,200 cases I mentioned earlier. We will use grant funds for that. We're seeking new grants to assist with that, and then we will look internally for funds as well. And that way, when we can reopen our lab functions, again, hopefully in February, then we will push forward and to get that cleared up as quickly as possible.
You said on Monday that $200,000 would probably cover about 50 cases.
Depends on the cost of the case. Right now, to outsource a DNA sexual assault kit, our contract has a cost of about $900. And so, you know, it just depends. What you have to look at as well is we know how many cases we have. We know how many safe kits we have that require analysis right now. But until you do the initial serology and you determine if it is a sufficient sample to actually do DNA testing on, we don't know what that final number is going to be. So we just have to work through it.
Well,
methodically.
if that's an average, what internal funds are you all targeting to test the other 550 cases?
Again, we're going to look within our budget. We're going to find money in different budgets within our budget. We have other sources, and we're going to seek grants. But as we've stated, we're committed to finding the funding to clear up our backlog.
And when will DPS start taking on those 20 cases a month? Is that something that starts right away? Or?
Yes, that's already underway. That's been
Okay.
underway for several months.
Okay.
Chief, some of the communities say they've already lost trust in the Austin Police Department and don't think that retraining all of these technicians will simply be enough. They're calling for scientists to take control. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, scientists are taking control. I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, we're in the process of hiring an individual to run our crime lab. We're in the final stages of the interview, and this will be a scientist who has run crime labs before and has the requisite experience. The way we were structured in the past, and this was something that came up in the review that we requested from the major city chiefs, we wanted them to come in and talk to us about a structure that works best. We had the highest position overseeing that lab was not a scientist, but they had a scientist that directly reported to them and ran operations for them. And we now realize that that's not a best practice, and we want the person that's actually running the operations on site at the highest level to be a scientist. And we're also going to hire a technical lead that will be a scientist as well. So we will have multiple levels of individuals with the requisite scientific knowledge that we believe will allow for the lab to operate appropriately, keep up with changing protocols, and to have educated scientific discussions with each other to ensure that we're operating appropriately.
You also mentioned in a public safety meeting last Monday that APD is currently doing their own review of the lab. What does that exactly mean?
Well, we talked about the different types of audits. We talked about the 17 audits, how we have the outside agencies that come in and do audits. Some of those 17 audits were also our own internal audit, and that's where we go in and we compare ourselves to the accreditation standards and all. So that's what we were talking about.
And y'all are currently doing that right now?
We've got right now we're doing the retraining of all of the personnel. We believe, based on the review that the Texas Forensic Science Commission has done on our lab, along for the scientific portion, and then the review that the Major City Chiefs Forensic Science Group did for the organizational. I believe we've got the information necessary. The other audits that are going on now are the actual cases themselves that we're taking a look at.
If you're talking about an analyst who did something like as you mentioned, the reagent that has to be freshly mixed each time it's used, I'm going to assume that those are the directions on the bottle or the packaging, or that this is fairly common knowledge. How do you retrain that? That sounds sloppy to me.
Right. Well, the training is very simple. We're going to remix our chemicals every day if the bottle says mix daily, and that's just it's just something that'll be written into their daily protocols. It won't be assumed that folks will follow a label. That's the manufacturer that writes that on there that says mix daily. Whether it's any less potent on day 2 or day 3, it doesn't matter. If they say mix daily, we're going to mix daily.
But that sounds almost negligent. If that was on the packaging as a manufacturer put, and this particular analyst declined to do that, that sounds sloppy.
Well, it's not a best practice, and that's why we're going to cease it, and when
But
we
would
open
this
back up,
person-
it's going to be absolutely understood that everyone is going to follow all of the chemical protocols, manufacturer recommendations, and then just operational requirements and protocols that will be put in place by our new lab director.
Would this person be facing any discipline for something like that?
You know, the whole lab's under review right now, and like we're looking at the cases involving some of the analysts, if we have people that were intentionally doing negligent acts, and we're gonna have to look at that. If we have people that made mistakes, then we're gonna retrain them and retool the lab and make sure we're operating appropriately. But it would be inappropriate to talk about any discipline at this point as we work our way through finding out what happened and our retraining.
But it is still possibly on the table at the end of the review.
We're doing a review on all aspects of the lab right now.
The Forensic Science Commission report, when it spoke of closing the lab, noted that it was not realistic to expect DPS to handle the additional cases, and that the PD should expect to invest significant funds in an outside lab. Why hasn't that been happening in the last few months?
Well, we have been. I mean, we've been outsourcing cases to labs. As I said, we've had grants from the NIJ in the past. So what we're working on doing is expediting it now, trying to identify funds so we can get this done in a much quicker manner, and then also working on the staffing so that once we do actually open the doors, we have staff and we have adequate staff that can handle the number of cases coming in, and we don't end up in a backlog.
Okay, but have
When
you
we
been
get these scientists hired, there's going to be 7 new scientists and a supervisor. When we get them hired, it just depends on what level of experience do they bring to us. Is this an experienced scientist that's currently working in a lab and we can bring them into our lab and get them up to speed relatively quickly? Or is this a newer scientist that's going to require a lengthier training? Again, with the goal being that we have a lab that is sufficiently staffed to handle the number of cases that we're taking into evidence.
So how many scientists do you think that you need total for it to be sufficient?
Well, we currently have 6, and we were just approved for 7 additional, so we're going to have 13 scientists plus a supervisor that will be performing the DNA analysis for us. All right.
Have you been outsourcing cases other than those old 3,000?
Of the current cases,
Right.
that's what we have the NIJ grant for.
That was this past week.
And we have prior NIJ grants as well to help us with our backlog.